Rishi Sunak supporter in just a few moments about the transparency that he suggests Liz Truss is avoiding. Meantime, John in Eltham says regarding the apparent empty shelves at Christmas because of this strike at the port. Tom, forget the empty shelves at Christmas. It won't be a problem. We won't be able to afford to buy anything anyway, says John. Meanwhile, and I knew this would happen. So yes, I knew this was coming. So thank you to everybody that's messaged. Jackie in North Watford. Tom, correction required. They froze the triple lock this year. They did. You're absolutely right. They froze the triple lock this year. But next year, in April, the triple lock will rise by inflation, which you could say is what you expected because that's what you were promised, and therefore to not get it last year or this year was unfair, and you can be very upset about that. And I'm just gently pointing out that there are plenty of people who are in work who are not seeing inflation busting pay rises. That's part of the reason why we're seeing the industrial action. I'm not for a minute trying to suggest that anybody on the state pension is rolling in it and laughing all the way to the bank. Just gently making the point just before the army starts to rise up. Jackie, thank you very much indeed. Paul's in Enfield. Do you want to talk about the energy crisis this winter? Hi, Paul.
Hi there. My question is, about 8-9 years ago, I had solar panels put on my roof, and that generates me an income of about 54p per kilowatt hour.
You've got to put that in terms of the length of the time the dishwasher's on for, Paul. Otherwise, I don't have a clue what you're on about.
Right, OK. So 8 years ago, if you put solar panels on your roof, then the energy company would pay you 50p per kilowatt hour to feed your electricity into the national grid. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually paid money for my solar panels.
Glorious.
But that money hasn't changed. So for the millions of people that do a feed-in tariff, why hasn't our feed-in tariff gone up, I don't know, 60, 65% with the rise in energy? Because they're selling our electric.
But isn't that because the way of producing the electric is far cheaper than anything else, say gas?
Yeah, but surely still all energy comes at a price.
Yes, but it just happens that the renewable price is far cheaper.
Yeah, but I'm actually giving them electric, and they're selling my electric at an inflated price. Well, so surely shouldn't I benefit from that?
I think you should be arguing for a greater cut of it, but I don't know how much it would rise by if it's not because you're not doing the fossil fuel method, which is the thing that's costing a hell of a lot to create the gas. You're using the cheaper renewables, for which we're grateful, Paul, don't get me wrong. And I see actually a suggestion today that people who put in heat pumps in their homes should get a rebate on the tax that they pay on buying their property, which might be a way to try and get people to upgrade the energy efficiency of their homes. Paul, thank you very much indeed. 7:54 is the time. Let's turn to Mel Stride, Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, former Cabinet Minister, of course, Conservative MP for Central Devon, a Rishi Sunak backer who is suggesting this morning that Liz Truss is avoiding transparency. Mel, thank you for joining the programme. Tell us why you think that is.
Good morning, Tom. Well, basically, there's an organisation called the Office for Budget Responsibility, and their role is to produce forecasts based around what the Chancellor of the day comes forward with in terms of new measures. And there's a very good reason why there's an independent body doing that, because it gives reassurance, particularly to the international markets that lend this country huge amounts of money at very low rates of interest, that the figures all add up. Now, what I think we know at this stage is that Liz is coming forward with an emergency budget shortly after September the 5th, and there'll be a number of very significant tax measures within that, plus some spending measures as well, as yet undetermined. And at the moment, the Liz camp, I believe, are saying that there will not be any OBR forecasts produced at that time. And that's kind of like flying blind. It means that you do all these dramatic things on tax, etc., but you don't actually know what the independent forecaster believes the impact will be on the public finances. And I think that's quite a serious situation were that to come about.
Three things. One, how long would it take for the OBR to produce a report in an emergency? Two, does it matter that the independent forecaster says we think it's going to be this and the Treasury, the government says, well, we think it's going to be this? And three, the OBR is legally required to do it anyway.
Okay, so let's go in reverse order, if you like. So legally required to do it anyway, yes, that's twice a year. It's required under its charter to provide a forecast, and that's typically around a normal budget and the spring statement. But if you have an emergency budget, clearly this is a third occasion on which exactly the same parameters apply. So you would expect to have a forecast under those circumstances. And indeed, the government can invite the OBR to do exactly that. So there's nothing unusual about that. In terms of how quickly the OBR could do this, under normal circumstances, they require about 10 weeks. But what they will have been doing is very clearly in the background, not just sitting there doing nothing, but they'll have been observing what the various candidates have suggested in terms of fiscal policy going forward, and they will have started work on that, and they will be liaising with departments like the Treasury and HMRC on tax in order to get those figures marshalled. So there's no doubt they could move much quicker than that matter of weeks. But there's an important point here, Tom, is there are two possible forecasts you could look at. One would be at least to update the status quo forecast, as it were, without additional measures being brought forward, because that position has deteriorated since the last forecast in March. And when Liz and others talk about the headroom, the fiscal headroom, the space to cut taxes on a funded basis, they are referring to that fiscal headroom against target. That will have shrunk, and we need to know by how much. And that the OBR must know
but what
now.
You're asking for, isn't it, Mr. Stride? What you're asking for here is, in an emergency, in a form of crisis for millions of people, you're asking for process and bureaucracy.
No, we're asking for transparency and reassurance that whoever wins this contest comes forward with is affordable and not reckless.
Do you think
now,
Liz Truss
it would
right
be crazy to not have that forecast?
Do you think Liz Truss is right to say that a recession isn't inevitable?
I think it's highly likely that that's the direction we're heading in. I mean, if you look at almost all the forecasts, the Bank of England's more recent forecast on this, that's where we're headed, and we're already in the foothills of that. It's going to be very difficult. I think the more important question is actually how do you ameliorate those problems? How do you strengthen the economy as much as you can? And the first thing you've got to do is control inflation. And I'm afraid that when Liz comes forward with £60 billion worth, it's an eye-watering number of permanent, baked-in, ongoing tax cuts that are unfunded and be funded through borrowing, that is simply going to fuel inflation. And the consequences of that, Tom, are that interest rates will have to go up still further, meaning people's mortgage payments have to go up, businesses have to pay more for the loans that they carry, and it will have a depressive effect upon the economy. The first thing you need to do is get on top of inflation, just as Maggie Thatcher did in the early 1980s, and then you can move to Lawsonian-style tax cuts. But you have to do it at the right time.
So as well as an economic failure or failing in understanding the economics of this, do you think that Liz Truss's plans and the lack of outlined support for people in the energy crisis is a moral failure too?
Well, you can choose your words. I think...
Well, they're not my words, to be fair. They're the Rishi Sunak's
that's fine.
Campaign's words.
Yes, in general, one can choose one's words, put it that way. Well, I really see it as effectively, as the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, we look very closely at all sorts of fiscal plans, and we have done over many, many years. And one of the most important things is that there is a transparency, so you know whether these numbers stack up or whether they're going to head us towards fiscal ruin. You have to answer that basic question. And the point that I make here is that if we're going to go into some kind of emergency budget with massive unfunded tax cuts, which can be put on the country's credit card for our children and our grandchildren, pay off in time, etc., and we don't know the answer to the critical question, what's that actually going to do to our fiscal targets? What's that going to do to inflation? What's it going to do to the amount that the government's borrowing? And you have all these international debt markets that are lending us all this money at low interest rates. What are they going to think? They're going to say, well, I don't want to take a punt on a country that organises its fiscal affairs in that way.
At the moment, under Liz Truss, this country is heading for fiscal ruin.
No, I didn't say that. I said you have to answer the question as to whether the measures being brought forward are responsible and are achievable within the fiscal
your answer at the moment has to be no, doesn't it?
I think it's looking doubtful, but the reality, Tom, is we're back to the beginning of this conversation. You can't answer that question unless you have the Office of Budget Responsibility telling you what the forecasts are based upon those measures. And at the moment, we appear to be going in a situation where we're just going to be flying blind. And I don't think that's right.
Very finally, I noted on the front page of the Financial Times, the bailout to Bulb is going to increase to around £4 billion, which might mean every house has an additional £150 or more on its bills next year. That can't be right, can it?
It's a very difficult situation because these companies were put in a situation where they clearly had a cap on what they could charge, but their input costs were spiraling ever upwards. So a lot of them got into trouble. That's just a fact of life under those particular circumstances. I think one of the problems with Bulb actually is that it hasn't and can't currently buy energy forward and hedge its position, which I think is exacerbating things at the moment. And I do think that needs to be looked at. But yes, 4 billion is a very large amount of money.
We're talking about the next Prime Minister to come, whether that be Truss or your man Sunak. But I note, Mr. Stride, on the front page of the Times, a poll amongst Conservative voters who have seller's remorse over the ousting of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Are you going to miss him?
I think Boris did some extraordinary things. I think to have won that 2019 election was a colossal achievement. I think performance through the pandemic, vaccination was absolutely amazing. And I think he's done a brilliant job when it's come to the war in Ukraine.
But you don't have any seller's remorse, particularly.
So in that sense, I think it was time ultimately for the party, and it was the party broadly that decided. I know some people try and pin it on one or two individuals. It was broadly the party that decided that there were just too many occasions when we were being put on the wrong side of some kind of moral dilemma. And I think, therefore, it probably was time to draw a line. But we have to look forward. And I think history will judge Boris very kindly. And I think he achieved an enormous amount of which we should all be proud.
Good to speak to you. Mel Stride, you're chair of the Treasury Select Committee, former Cabinet Minister. You are Conservative MP for Central Devon and so on, who is backing Rishi Sunak. We'll talk more about the knife crime that is surging around the country, including, tragically, in the family of Tyson Fury, who lost his cousin in an incident in Greater Manchester over the weekend. Details to come after the news at 8 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.